Hello and welcome to all of you to this side event at the 44th session of the UN Human Rights Council. We are very happy that you all participate today. My name is Caroline Ausserer. I'm a journalist, diversity trainer and moderator based in Berlin, and I'm very happy and honored to lead you through this event today. Today we will talk about the recognition and respect of diverse families in times of a pandemic, of a global pandemic. The health crisis, as you know, has impacted all of us, but some of us more. Marginalized populations, vulnerable populations, be it individuals or families, have aggravated situations to face, and we will talk about this and about different realities and experiences in different regions of the world. And we have a very great list of speakers today. I'm very nervous and anxious to hear all of you. But before we kick off, I have some announcements to make, like organizational, and I will start with 3 thank you. First of all, thank you to the co-sponsors, delegations of South Africa and delegation of Switzerland. Then I want to thank the co-organizers, that is the Global Interfaith Network, the International Family Equality Day, and CUC Netherlands. And last but not least, I want to thank 2 colleagues of mine who helped me with the moderation, and they also did a lot of work to preparing this side event. This is Maria van Kennel, the founder and board member of IFED, International Family Equality Day, and Simon Petitjean, Global Interfaith Network Programs Manager. Thank you for all your work. So this event will be recorded and it will be made available later on online. So if there are any safety issues, so please get in contact with us and we will take care of this. Then the chat functions, you might see they are still working, but just for a short period of time. So we invite all the participants. We have over 85 participants and there are also several delegations there, and I welcome everyone to write something in the chat to say who you are, for which organizations you work, so that we have a little bit of information there. So then the chat functions will be closed soon to to create this safe space. But there will, however, a moderated Q&A section. So during the whole event, you are invited to write your questions there that will be then answered at the end of this event. So the overview today of this event is after introductory remarks. We have 5 panelists that will bring their expertise and realities from different regions of the world. We will make a little world tour, so to say, and we will finish with Q&A and concluding remarks, among which we will also hear from Victor Madrigal-Borlos, the UN independent expert on the protection against violence and the discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity. Sorry. I'm very happy that you accepted our invitation and that you're here participating with us in this event. And I welcome everybody again and would say, let's start. So if we talk about families, for a number of years, the discussions of family have been dominated by right-wing groups who claim there was only one way to be family. So we need to counter this growing conservative space and reclaim family values and recognize the diversity and equality of families. So there is agreed language in UN negotiated legacy that various forms of family exist. So this is often obscured by those who wish to reify a heteronormative nuclear family. So let's unpack this, and after these introductory remarks, see how this plays out into today's international human rights framework. I invite you to join us in this virtual world trip. Our first stop takes us to South Africa, and I hereby welcome Ms. Nelia Barnard, Deputy Permanent Representative of the South African delegation to the UN. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, members of the Global Interfaith Network, distinguished panelists, members of diplomatic delegations and friends. First of all, I wish to convey warm wishes from our Ambassador, Her Excellency Ambassador Mkakato Diseko, who regrettably cannot be with you today. However, to just reaffirm the strong bonds of solidarity with our mission. We are very pleased to participate in this very timely virtual side event, and we express our full support. We're always proud as South Africans that our Constitution was the first in the world to protect and provide protection for LGBTI people. It also respects the diversity of families in all its forms. We know that families are and always have been an important building block of African societies. The concept of Ubuntu, which means I am because we are, is likewise a part of our own self-understanding. There are so many ways of forming families, and all must be protected, even more so during the health crisis we are living through now. Moderator, we do live in strange times that we will all remember vividly in years to come. You could not have chosen a better moment to reflect on how important it is for the beautiful diversity of families to be celebrated and protected by all of us together as the United Nations, but also to reflect about how COVID has itself impacted on diverse families and people of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. I think we would all agree that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the vulnerabilities of diverse families and people at this moment. The High Commissioner for Human Rights made a striking statement in her annual report when she referred to the discrimination being faced by LGBTI people and families while seeking health services. In their statement on the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia and Biophobia on 17 May, human rights experts reminded us that the fight against the pandemic is not waged on a level playing field. Diverse families encounter legal challenges to formalize relationships, with these then made more difficult by restriction of movement during the pandemic, which can separate family members, both adults and children. The issue of psychosocial support is also important, which needs to address challenges for diverse families, such as job opportunities, paid sick leave, unemployment compensation, even more so during the pandemic. With that said, we look forward to the contributions the expert panelists will make as to how we can build back better for diverse families at this very trying time. Let us harness our shared humanity to make sure that we also remember this pandemic for having brought us something positive: better health systems, the silencing of guns, lesser violence in our homes, greater compassion for those at risk, and more emphasis on what binds us together and on what we treasure in each other. I wish you fruitful deliberations and happy memories of this very important virtual event. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bernard. Thank you very much for your introductory remarks. We now have a short recorded message by UN Women by Anita Bhatia, Deputy Executive Director of UN Women. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. I am pleased to convey this message on behalf of UN Women for this important side event. The COVID-19 pandemic is exacerbating inequalities and heightening vulnerabilities across all societies. It has particularly damaging impacts on those already stigmatized and discriminated against in society and in healthcare settings. The social and economic impacts of the crisis for LGBTIQ+ people are often devastating, including by inhibiting access to livelihoods, housing, healthcare, and support services. The deprioritization of health needs in particular can have grave consequences for both mental and physical health. Quarantining measures have resulted in LGBTIQ+ people, especially youth, being put in danger in hostile homes or abusive relationships. Furthermore, some governments' emergency response measures are being used to justify rolling back human rights. This is a very worrisome trend. UN Women, therefore, urgently calls on communities and governments to uphold the human rights of all LGBTIQ+ people's specific needs and risks must be identified and addressed in all policies and budgets. We call for more support and more shelters for survivors of violence, for equal access to healthcare services, and equal access to stimulus packages and social protection measures. Furthermore, UN Women calls on governments, on civil society and the private sector to recognize the diversity of families. As our flagship report has shown, families today are extremely diverse and changing, with only a third composed of heterosexual couples and their children. Laws and policies, including the response and recovery to COVID-19, need to be based on the reality of how families live today. In this respect, the UN Framework for the Immediate Socioeconomic Response to COVID-19 acknowledges the impacts of the pandemic on the most marginalized, including families and LGBTI people. It promotes systematic mapping of vulnerable and marginalized peoples and calls for specific measures for their protection and access to health services and equipment for them. In conclusion, let me reiterate that UN Women is committed to achieving gender equality for all, including sexual and gender minorities. I wish you a productive panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita Batia, Executive Director of UN, Deputy Executive Director of UN Women. We now travel to Samoa, Australia, and I welcome very much Trizina Imanya Brown, our next speaker, Fa'afafina and international trans activist from Samoa, now living in Australia. She's the former co-chair of the Global Interfaith Network, the executive director of the Pacific Human Rights Initiative, co-chair of the steering committee of the International Trans Fund, and co-secretary general of ILGA World. Please, Imanya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Caroline, and welcome everyone. Where do I start? So this is about recognition and respect of diverse families in COVID-19 times. I am honored to be asked to open the first doorways into what will hopefully be an evening full of knowledge, experiences, and interventions planned for all of you, in the hope that you will walk away after tonight with the full knowledge that we as activists, what we are fighting for, what we are speaking up about, is what almost everyone else who is from a cis background never ever has to fight for, and that is the recognition and respect for their own families, because they are considered the template, the Judeo-Christian model of a nuclear family. Well, tonight, we're going to smash that model and template into pieces. So the first part of my intervention is, of course, theological. Well, because let's face it, we're slowly winning the battle on the judicial front. There's 69 more countries left to go to decriminalize, but this war is going to be fought on the religious battlegrounds around the world. Religion, faith, interfaith is where our opponents will face their Armageddon. It's our last stance against the pushback by the religious right, the moral majority, colonialism, patriarchy and the heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, gender binary supremacy, and nuclear family supremacy. It is where we as LGBTI activists, defenders, and warriors will be fighting alongside all of you, our allies, in this fight. And the other part of my intervention is about my indigenous and traditional Samoan Ainoa family, embracing, claiming, and weaponizing my indigeneity as a global South trans woman of color activist to dismantle the idea that my family is not normal. So let's deep dive into it. Why is it that in the book of Genesis, God talks about absolutes, and yet the religious right do not push back against the nuance of God's creations? And I want to focus on this because for me, this is at the heart of the oppression against families. So all of you in the religious right, all of you who are anti-LGBTIQ, you accept the nuances of God's creations in everything else. In Genesis 1 verse 5, he made day and night, and you embrace sunrise and sunset, which is neither day and night. In Genesis 1 verse 10, he made dry land and seas, and you all love the beaches and rivers. In Genesis 1 verse 16, he made the sun, the moon, and the stars, and you accept and are searching, spending billions of dollars looking for planets and meteors and comets that exist in other universes. In Genesis 1 verse 20 to 26, he made creatures of the sea, the sky, and the land, and you accept creatures that traverse all three. Yet in Genesis 1:27, he made man and woman, and you refuse to accept gender and sexual orientation as a spectrum in his creations. You stop, you arm, you weaponize, and you move to obliterate anything that does not fit that limited definition of what a man and a woman is and the spectrum in between. And you see at the heart of this non-acceptance of families, other than the nuclear Judeo-Christian family, is this notion of binary supremacy. You accept everything else so wonderfully made by God, but you refuse to accept us that exist in between. But know this, for every one of you that weaponizes the Bible against LGBTI and indigenous communities and diverse families, we will double down. We will stand up. We will match every word of hate you use under the guise of religion with words and affirming passages from our sacred texts that show our God loves us. And he sent his only son to die on the cross for all of our sins, including yours. And today I testify that I am filled with his light and his love. And I will stand up to you. I will fight your oppression with light. I will fight your hatred with love. And the light of 1,000 suns will drown your hatred and bigotry and oppression and violence. My name is Twisina Imanya Brown, and I am a soldier of the true and loving God that embraces, loves, and recognizes every human being and their chosen families in all their amazing diversity. For my own family, I want to witness and testify about the power of God in giving me my family, which I want to acknowledge which is not the norm. I have 2 adopted Filipino Samoan sons. They live with me in Australia. And although they never came from my womb, because I do not have one as a trans woman, I can categorically tell you that these kids who own each half of my heart came from my soul. From a yearning to parent, to care, to mother, to offload all my spirituality and essence into these 2 souls in my hope and prayer that one day they will fulfill their God-given destinies and gifts, whatever they may be. They may always meant to be my children, and my journey to be an adoptive parent in a regime that is 99.9% Christian nation that has decriminalized same-sex relations but also criminalized sodomy in the same laws was not an easy one. I created legal precedent, being the first South African trans woman to legally adopt children from Samoa, paving the way for others to be able to do so. And my reward, a family that is not the norm, a single working mom, 2 incredibly Christian faith-believing Catholic boys who love me unconditionally, and a father figure. Well, that's what I'm there for. But know this, God's greatest gift to humankind was the freedom of choice. Our greatest gift to God is by our choices, and we pray that we make better choices as a human race. I've said it before and I'll say it again. These are dark times in our humanity. The time to act is now. If you are working for a state member of the United Nations, I plead with you. Step up. Extend your hands to me and my Black and brown LGBTIQ people of color and our diverse families. Stop enabling states that violate their oath to abide by the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Yes, you heard me. You tell us you are engaging in diplomacy, but we all see from down here is an environment of enablement of our continued repression and perpetuating violence and discrimination against LGBTI populations. I'm begging you, push back, say enough, say no more. Turn your back on our oppression and shield us from their toxic and deadly behavior. And to all of the states that are listening, follow the lead taken by South Africa and Switzerland. And to my fellow activists and defenders and warriors, you honor my family, you honor me as a human rights defender and warrior. I wish you safety. I wish you blessings. I wish you strength to stay in the light and in the fight. I wish you know this, that I see you. I see your family, and I know you see mine. Let's do this. Let's continue the fight. Let's take back our future, the future that we want for the planet that we have, so that we can all enjoy the humanity that we deserve. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Imania, for this very touching and passionate words of yours, and also to give insights, on consequences also of the pandemic for indigenous and trans and interfaith communities, and smashing the binary nuclear family supremacy. So we now move on after this introductory part and dive even deeper into the topic of today, the recognition and respect of diverse families in times of a global pandemic. So we have asked our panelists to seek answers to the questions: what are the impacts of COVID-19 on the communities they live and work with? And what are their demands and recommendations to states and UN agencies when it comes to COVID relief? And what does it mean in the long term? So if we travel on in our virtual world trip, we now travel to Kenya, which is one of the 70 UN member states in the world which still criminalize consensual same-sex acts between adults, according to ILGA World's last edition of state-sponsored homophobia report. So a very warm welcome to our first panelist, Benny Ondongo, who is the founder and director of Coast Women for Women and part of the board of the International Family Equality Day. Benny, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I am Benny Odongo. Some knows me as B.A. Odongo. And I'm so grateful to be here on this day of the recognition and respect of family diversities in the global pandemic. I come from Kenya. I am an activist. I'm also a parent and a transgender non-conforming person. And I also sit in the board of IFED, and I'm also the founder and the director of Coast Women for Women. I just want to bring the overview of family diversity in Kenya. The issue of LGBTI parented families and or rainbow families have been an area that have remained untapped for the longest time, despite the fact that we have different LGBTI organizations that are working on LGBTI rights. The Kenyan Constitution states very well. Chapter 4, Article 45, 1 states very well that family is the natural and a fundamental unit of society and shall enjoy the recognition and the respect from the state. But this only favors the heterosexual families because the government of Kenya does not recognize the relationship between same-sex, and same-sex relationship will always remain illegal in Kenya. On 24th May 2019, the High Court of Kenya refused to declare Section 162 and 165 unconstitutional because the government of Kenya does not recognize the relationship between same-sex, and same-sex families will always remain illegal in Kenya. This ruling have made the LGBTI parented families and LGBTI persons to continue suffering stigma and discrimination in the society, which leads to violations and sometimes results to death. The LGBTI parented families have continued to live in fears, while others live a double life to please the society for their safety and security and of their children. We also have the issue of culture and tradition. The culture and tradition have played a very major role in the African society. The culture have been used as a guidance to handle different issues in the society, including the family issues. The culture have made the society believe that being an LGBTI person is a curse and unnatural. It have made also the society believe that family is all about blood and family name. And family will always be father, mother, and children. And these have been derived from the gender roles. The African society have completely painted a clear picture in everyone's mind of gender role and how a family should look like. This have made the LGBTI person always to remain vulnerable and always remain among the minorities. Being an LGBTI parented family in Kenya is always a daily struggle because many lives in fear. To change the society mindset on the LGBTI parented family, it needs a clear strategy and a combined effort. The Rainbow's family safety and security are always at risk from the attack of the society. We also have the issue of religion. Religion have been used as a weapon against LGBTI persons. The religious leaders have used different Bible scriptures like Sodoma and Gomorrah. Religious leaders consider being an LGBTI person as a sin and an unclean. In religion, family is for procreation, and family will always be father, mother, and children. The religious leaders have denied the LGBTI person an opportunity to practice their faith because some religious leaders have literally in Kenya sent out the LGBTI people from the mosque and from the church. For an LGBTI person who wants to introduce their children to the church, it becomes a challenge. And that's why we call different organizations like GIN to help us work on the issue of religion. I will not forget about to mention the issue of the impact of COVID-19 and Rainbow's family in Kenya. Coronavirus have come with many different challenges, but one major challenge is the economy. In Kenya, most of the LGBTI parents are self-employed, and the coronavirus have left many without job and a source of income. And this have led for the LGBTI parents to suffer from anxiety and frustrations. There's also a threat of Rainbow family being thrown out of the street because the parents cannot afford to pay the house rent anymore. The COVID-19 have also resulted to the increase of intimate partner violence amongst Rainbow families. And the fear is all these violations happens in front of our children. I also want to talk about Coast Women for Women. Coast Women for Women is the first upcoming organization in Kenya to deal with the Rainbow families. Coast Women for Women wants to make the word a better phrase for the Rainbow family through advocating for the inclusion of family diversity in Kenya. Our focus is to amplify the voices and create awareness of the existence of Rainbow families in Kenya. Our key recommendation is number one, the research and the documentation. There's so many research that have been done about the life of LGBTI person, but we have none that have been done on the LGBTI parented families or Rainbow family. Through doing the research and documentation, we'll also tell the government that we do exist. And through doing the research and documentation, we'll help Coast Women for Women as an organization to come up with the best program that suits the Rainbow family in Kenya. Number two is stakeholders dialogue. We need to have stakeholders dialogue to involve different stakeholders on board to make sure that we talk about the issue of family diversity in the society, and also to talk about the policies, because the existence policies, none of them favors the LGBTI or Rainbow's family in Kenya. We are also calling for continuous support for safe space and support group for the LGBTI parented families or Rainbow's family. Ubuntu forever. I am because we are. And we believe that everybody have a family. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benny, for shedding light on family diversity in Kenya and the challenges diverse families in Kenya still face. We wanted to make a trip now to Belize, but I've heard that the colleague is sick, so we have to skip this, correct? Yes, so we, unfortunately, Delicia Castillo Salazar is not with us today. So we travel to South Africa, and where we find Dr. Nontando Hadebe. And Nontando is a woman theologian, research fellow at the Department of Historical and Constructive Theology at the University of Bloemfontein, and chair of the South African chapter of the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians in South Africa. And I may add that South Africa is one of the few countries that has the protection of sexual orientation and gender identity in its constitution. So, Nontando, the floor is yours. Thank you.
A very good afternoon, everyone. It is indeed a privilege for me to be here. I am a heterosexual woman who is allied to my brothers and sisters, and I'm saying loud and clear, not in my name will I allow homophobia to exist. And therefore, this is who I am, and this is what I stand for. And so in my presentation, which I'm going to ask Simon to show, I'm going to be looking at, because the first point that I make is that COVID-19 affects everybody, but it's also contextual. In other words, we need to understand the context in which it is happening so that we can see its impact on the family. And so to map out the context, I am focusing on three contextual issues in Southern Africa. The first one being the family in the African context. The second one being lessons from HIV and AIDS. Let's remember that we are still living in the pandemic of HIV and AIDS, and there's much that we can learn from that. And then looking at the role of religion. So there's going to be some overlap with the other presentations. Firstly, when we look at the African family, and that's where I want to start. The African, in the understanding of the African family, the family is embedded in the community. So the family and the community are literally one, they are interdependent. So you don't have this notion of an autonomous, independent institution that is accountable to no one. So that's the first point that I'm making. And then the second point is that the family and the community are engaged in a mutual accountability relationship. And they are both committed to the ethic of Ubuntu that was mentioned by the ambassador and the previous speaker. And now Ubuntu, and I think you will hear more and more about that, looks at the interdependence and says that I am because of you. My humanity is tied to yours, and it doesn't have exceptions. It doesn't say because you are this sexual orientation or because you are that. To be human is to be humane. I am attached to you irrespective of your identity. And that is where this phrase and this famous proverb comes from, where it says it takes a village to raise a child. This interconnectedness of people and oneness and interrelationship indeed makes the traditional African family a lesson for us today. And so we go on and we see that there was already diversity within traditional life. There were diverse families, intergenerational, as well as polygamous families. So there was diversity. And more important, every single person belonged to a family because every single person was a member of the community. I remember growing up that all the elders in my community were either mother or father, and they had the right, like my parents, to discipline me. And unfortunately, if I did anything, the neighbor could discipline me and report me to my parents, who will again discipline me. So this intricateness is something that we need to see. No isolation, and no one was excluded because of any form of identity. So this is really something that we need to hold on to, this embeddedness of people in their community and lack of exclusion. So I really wanted to, to really emphasize that. And so when we talk about that, we can easily ask ourselves, so what's happening today? Why is the African family today broken? Why is there homophobia? Why are people being excluded? And we can go back to the legacy of colonialism and early forms of Christianity that brought homophobia, that brought penal codes, that criminalized people's identity. Those came with the laws of discrimination and racism that were part of the colonial package, which still continues even today. And we will look at some of the forms of Christianity that support the discrimination. And as I said, let's get some lessons from HIV and AIDS, because it's still a concurrent pandemic. And the 3 lessons that I want to take from HIV and AIDS is that vulnerability to infection is not a health issue. It's a human rights issue, because why should anybody be vulnerable to something that will cause their death? It's a human rights issue. And then secondly, to say that the religious and cultural beliefs mentioned by the previous speakers are implicated in the higher levels of infection among women, children, vilification and discrimination against LGBTI persons, which led to higher infection and lack of access to programs, prevention programs. And then while I don't, while I'm not wanting to vilify in medical solutions, but when the ARVs came, all the social injustice was swept under the carpet. The answer to HIV and AIDS became ARV. So the social issues that were raised were not dealt with. So that's the lesson that we get from HIV and AIDS. And then now we want to go to the role of religion, because in this region, in the whole of Africa, Southern Africa, religion is critical to our lives. And so when we think about religion, we must know that religions are neither neutral, they are not monolithic, they are in constant conflict. And I want to give an example from our own religion, which is Christianity. For example, during the HIV and AIDS pandemic, you had a number of narratives, and I want to take 2 of them. The first group of Christians said HIV and AIDS epidemic is a punishment from God for sexual immorality and homosexuality. And then the second group of Christians said HIV is a virus, and Christians are called to care for the sick and to work against all forms of injustice. And so what we begin to see, and I'm taking my own religion, Christianity, is that there are multiple contradictory messages out there. You have Christians supporting racism, patriarchy, all kinds of discrimination. And then on the other hand, you have Christians with a different message, who are rooting their message in the dignity of all persons created in the image of God. So when you're talking religion, you must know that you are talking about a very noisy, conflictual body that is spurning out all kinds of contradictory messages. So really, I think that is a very important point to note. And so now when we come to the context of COVID-19, having just said that, we see already in COVID-19 the manifestation of injustice, that the risk factors are higher amongst vulnerable communities. For example, we are told that in order to practice preventative measures, we need to be washing our hands, we need social distancing. How does that work for people in crowded dwellings? How does that work for crowded neighborhoods and for people who have to earn their livelihood in the marketplace? And so we already see that vulnerability having a face of inequality. And even when we say that children must learn online, what are we talking about? Most families don't even have those online facilities, let alone drinking water. So we need to be aware of the injustices that are coming and presenting the face of COVID-19 as the face of injustice. And we've also seen that the home, the inequalities, pre-existing inequalities, gender inequalities, homophobia are now exploding as we see the rise in violence against women, femicide, violence against LGBTI persons, exploding in these private spaces as people are locked down and they are, inaccessible. And then we begin to see again that the underlying inequalities that we've spoken about in HIV, that have been perpetuated by different voices of religion, continue to make COVID-19, a pandemic, just like HIV and AIDS, that strikes the most vulnerable. And so when we are talking about, like, it's very interesting because even with HIV, instead of dealing with the social issues of injustice like gender, homophobia, classism, racism, you will go and find a medical treatment. So ARVs came up, so everything about social injustice suddenly disappears. And even right now, if you listen to the narratives, it's always, let's find a vaccine. We need a narrative that says that shelter for the poor is part of responding to COVID-19. Gender inequality, protection of all citizens is part of responding to COVID-19. Drinking water in every home is part of responding to COVID-19. Creating homes with dignity is part of responding to the social crowding and the lack of spaces that poor people are forced to live in. So when we're thinking COVID-19, we cannot just be focusing on the vaccine, but we need to see that a response that will deal with COVID-19 has to deal with these existing forms of social injustice. So that COVID-19, whatever solution, will eradicate poverty, inequality, all forms of violence, homophobia. So this is the opportunity that we have. So let's have vaccine plus human rights. And so this is really what we're doing. And I myself, what am I doing? I'm representing the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians. And we are taking the struggle for gender equality, equality of all people, into the theological realm. Not only do we critique dominant theologies, but we recreate using alternative readings of scriptures. We are multi-faith, so we've got members from all the faiths. And so we recreate using the stories of oppressed people as our primary text. We use that as a primary text to critique religion and all oppressive structures that use religion to diminish, dehumanize people. And we say, not in our names. We are going to take that fight into the theological realm. And then the second organization that I'm involved in, for KISA, now we are dealing with homophobia in churches. We are facing it head on. And we are saying that we are creating dialogue between pastors and LGBTI communities to sit in the same room, listen to each other's stories, read the same text, and analyze these so that we can together dismantle the bullet texts that are used to dehumanize human beings.
Nintendo, sorry, I have to ask you to come to an end. I'm sorry.
Yes, thank you. I get carried away. I'm too passionate. So, so we really strike on that because it is our fundamental belief that we start on the dignity of all people and human rights. And so I conclude by saying, a response to COVID is already a response to human rights violation. So if we have human rights plus Ubuntu equals community and social context where all diverse families thrive and are able to overcome pandemics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nintendo, for highlighting the impact of COVID-19 for diverse families, also from a South African perspective, and to emphasize that social inequalities and injustices that render poorer families, women, children, LGBTI people, rainbow families vulnerable, they must be addressed by states. So in our travel around the world, we now go to South America. We go to Argentina, which is the home of the world's first progressive gender identity law. So already in 2012, the country approved the right to gender identity with a simple procedure based on self-determination. And we move on to our next speaker, who is Andrea Rivas. She's a human rights defender and founder and president of AFDA, Asociación Familias Diversas en Argentina, and a member of the board of directors of the International Family Equality Day there as well as director of the Pride House, the Community Center of Buenos Aires, and a member of the CSO core group of the Equality Rights Coalition. She will tell us more about family diversity in the South American country, and the floor is yours, Andrea.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to participate in this event, this wonderful event with these passionate colleagues that I'm sharing the floor. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the equal marriage law in Argentina, which allows all families to enjoy the same legal opportunities. It also had a huge impact in the Latin American region, and after this law, others were passed that give Argentina a good legal framework of protection for LGBT+ people. But this is not enough to access real equality in Argentina due to the structural causes of exclusion, such as poverty, high level of unemployment, or informal employment, and the lack of knowledge of public servants about our rights. And in a time of economic fragility, COVID-19 arrived in our country. So now the global pandemic COVID-19 threatens the life and the health of the world population. And the measures that have been taken to face it in different states requires that they are necessarily non-discriminatory and do not result in human rights violations, especially among the most vulnerable population, within which are our families, and we must be addressed as a priority. In the case of the LGBT community of all ages, it requires special attention, since the impact of these measures is differentiated due to the extreme vulnerability of our communities and the intersectional forms of discrimination. In Argentina, the vast majority of our community is employed in informal, precarious, and unregulated sectors of the economy. The Argentine state took social assistance measures where LGBT+ population were included, especially trans people. The work in coordination with the LGBT organizations was key for the national and local governments. Without this coordination, it would not have been possible to reach out to our population so quickly. But today, the efforts have to continue because we are facing a long, very long quarantine, more than 100 days, and the economic situation and the quality of our life is very difficult. In Buenos Aires, at the LGBT community center that I run, we are given legal assistance, and every day the cases are more and more violent. We also have the problem of the domestic violence increasing, lack of resources, essential resources like food, water. Water was an issue in the poor neighborhoods of the city of Buenos Aires. Also, the lack of access of housing. So making our families visible has become very difficult again. That is why the celebration of Hiv is so important. In Argentina, for example, the city of Buenos Aires joined this celebration, and it is an immense help to recognize the real equality of our families. We have another allies too, and the Embassy of the Netherlands here, it is a great ally for us. The COVID-19 brought a large closet with it, especially for lesbian and bisexuals, especially for children and youth. It is a myth to think that because we are with this framework of laws that we have an equal marriage, it is easier to become visible in this context of pandemic. Children are quarantining at home without going to school, and many of these homes are not safe places to express their sexual orientation or gender identity, and there are limited helplines for them. Access to justice is limited because the judicial administration in Argentina is not fully working, and this is really unacceptable for me, because to exercise a right, it is necessary to have access to justice, and this is limited right now in Argentina. But that's a great photo. In the middle of this situation, I think there is hope. Let us focus our attention on those who have the least and need us the most, our children, the younger generation, and also our elders. The response to the crisis must be an effort to work not only nationally, but globally, multilaterally, intersectionally, with participation in the decision-making not only by the leaders of the states, but with the participation of representatives of the LGBT+ civil society organizations. States have an obligation to respect human rights, and measures must be taken into account the principles of Syracuse and Sochi. So, in 2021, IFED wants to celebrate the beauty, uniqueness, and value of every family, no matter their composition, origins, or legal status. For this reason, and knowing that if you are here today, this cause unites us, I encourage you to join our next IFED celebration, being our authentic best. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea, for being so outspoken about what needs to be done in relation to the recognition and acceptance and equal treatment of diverse families. And I wanted to encourage, since we now come to our last panelist, all participants to send their questions and comments and to write it in the Q&A section so that we can then cluster them and see what we can answer at the end. So our next panelist is Dr. Dominic Richardson. He leads social policy and economic analysis at UNICEF Office of Research. And 2 years ago, he was awarded the Young Trust Award for outstanding contributions in international family studies by the National Council for Family Relations in the US. And thank you very much for joining this discussion. And the floor is yours, Dominic.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. Recognizing and respecting diverse families in public policy at a time of COVID-19 is necessary to ensure all families and all children are protected from the negative effects of the crisis. A key tool for addressing negative health, social, and economic effects of the global pandemic is social protection policy, and specifically family policy. Yet at present, such policies define families in various ways, and it's not always, well, it's certainly not diverse ways. They have conditions based on gender. They often exclude the most marginalized members of society for reasons as basic as not recognizing their diverse family form. Article 2 of the UNCRC, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, states that children's rights must be protected irrespective of a child or his or her parents or legal guardian's race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national, ethnic, social origin, property, disability, birth, or other status, as well as be protected against all forms of discrimination on the basis of the status, activities, expressed opinions, or beliefs of the child's parents, legal guardians, or family members. At present, it's true to say that not all states meet these standards, certainly not in terms of recognizing diverse family forms in social protection policies, either before and what I want to tell you now is in response to the COVID-19 crisis. That said, if there's one potential silver lining, it's that COVID-19 provides an opportunity to reassess our approaches to inclusivity in health, employment, education, and welfare for families and children. This is good for both our societies, and it's good for the benefit benefits of all families, including those with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, and expressions from all around the world. What constitutes a family has always been a topic of debate in international circles. This debate needs to end because it's critical for policy to have a consensus on when a family is a family. Indeed, we need a more inclusive consensus if we want family policies and social policies more broadly to be inclusive, naturally, and effective in their roles to reduce poverty, vulnerability, and inequality, to achieve the rights set out in various conventions, and to meet the ambitions of the Sustainable Development Goals. From the UNCRC perspective, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, 2 articles clarify why diverse families must be recognized in legislation for families with children. That's Article 2, which requires a universal commitment to ensuring the rights for each child within their jurisdiction without discrimination of any kind, as I mentioned before. And Article 3, which dictates that all state parties in all actions concerning children, whether by public or private social welfare institutions or through legislation, must be taken in the best interests of the child. Yet today, restricted definitions of what constitutes a family or a family member in social policy legislation, by marriage, by gender or sexual orientation, by birth or adoption, means that some families are excluded from public policies designed to support child raising. In these cases, countries are in contravention of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. The economic downturn due to COVID-19 is expected to be deep and persistent for many countries, most countries, resulting in increased and unequal poverty risks, greater food insecurity, higher infant mortality and child health concerns, and risks damaging both youth employment and education for years to come, all of which are key Sustainable Development Goals, itself an inclusive framework that promises to leave no one behind. Evidence from previous crises shows that economic stimulus through business supports like equity injections can reduce poverty risks in families and children. However, often austerity follows and poverty risks increase. There's closure of key services for children, increased levels of child abandonment, negative impacts on housing security, adult mental health and suicides, and so on. And worrying for COVID, austerity has been linked to further outbreak of infectious disease. Social protection policies, on the other hand, from insurance to social transfers and social services, are shown to effectively protect families from the worst of the economic downturns, from food insecurity, from exclusion from health services and school, from unemployment, and from mental illness. However, to date, social protection policies in response to COVID have been one-off or temporary, and often conditional on employment. In the vast majority of cases, they are simply expansions of existing policies which are already excluding diverse family forms. In contrast, fiscal stimulus to business has received substantially more investment than social protection responses. In high-income countries alone, where over $8 trillion have been spent, 6 times as much has gone on business intervention than social protection responses. These fiscal stimulus approaches, they do protect businesses and jobs, but they are most likely to miss out on the most vulnerable and the marginalised. And they are less effective, according to the research we've just completed and published, than direct payments to families. I don't want to elaborate further on the damage austerity can do. All in all, though, my main point is that the recognition and respect of diverse families in times of global pandemic is at the heart of the challenge, and the crisis will hit the most vulnerable the hardest, as others have said. And in responses to the crisis, and if the responses to the crisis are also biased, which is what the evidence we're getting is they are to diverse family forms, they will accentuate the inequalities that those families are already experiencing. A review of policies mapped by the World Bank and IMF show that this is most often the case. Our hope now is that at least we can ensure that diverse family forms are not excluded from the recovery and reimagination of welfare that follows the crisis. Discussions such as this one today are important for expressing in the strongest terms that such exclusions must end. In short, as governments and societies respond to the greatest social challenges of a generation, COVID-19 provides an opportunity to reset many of the inequalities inherent in our social protection policies, our public services and legislation. But this requires a more inclusive understanding of what family is, as well as a revision of how best to meet the needs of the most marginalised groups in society. Yet despite good evidence of the role of social protection in doing this and its role in COVID-19, these responses have remained so far too traditional, excessively conditional, and vastly underfunded compared to fiscal stimulus measures. This must change if we are to avoid further inequality for diverse families. It's in the tenets of universality as a foundation that we can find equality, and this is not beyond the means of government. At all policy levels, governments can take a role. They have the potential and the responsibility to protect families of all kinds in all their diverse forms. And not only because all families play an important role in our societies and in our social progress, certainly as we measure through the SDGs, but also because any and all exclusions from public interventions or the expression of rights create unnecessary costs for people, unnecessary costs for society, for welfare and economies, and they create a culture and a damaging culture of a sense of other. And finally, if we don't address it, we're just adding to a long list of social challenges that we leave behind for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic, for sharpening our focus on children's rights and also the contributions of UNICEF and in this regards. And I want to highlight again a sentence that stick in my ear: the exclusions must end. And this is also why we organize this event. So we need a more inclusive consensus about diversity of families, and not to debate about this, because those are families and those are already living these realities that are very often exclusionary. And thank you also for reminding us the obligations of the states and the responsibilities to protect diverse families, and also in view of the coming the following after the COVID relief, that this might get better. So we move on to our next speaker, and it's Kuchatan Sandhu, also called Nanu, and he's the president of UN Globe, the group representing LGBTIQ+ staff in the UN system, as well as a board member of International Family Equality Day. And I invite you very much for your concluding remarks, and again to all the participators to write us the questions you have, your comments, and since the Q&A is coming up soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and a big thank you to you all for inviting me to participate today. It's an honor to be here amongst such titans and giants of our community. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge those who have come before us, our ancestors, our transcestors, those are activists, our human rights defenders that have paved the way for us to be here today. I'm sure if you can all hear me. So how do I do justice in 4 or 5 minutes to summarize the fantastic interventions that have been shared by our panelists today? So I took some key learnings from them today, which have said that, well, diverse families have always existed, regardless of what society tells us. And they've always existed in their purest forms. So diverse families are symbols of love, strength, and resilience. Yet pervasive inequalities give way to further discrimination, violence, if not death, not just against us as LGBTIQ people, but against our loved ones. In particular, how religion is used often in our names to oppress families, our families, and diminish the diversity that has existed since we have walked this earth. Consequently, LGBTIQ families are left to fend for themselves through self-employment in the informal economy as gig workers. whether they have a lack, where they even have a more further lack of protection, including the lack of what Dominic mentioned, the lack of relevant social protection policies. At the basis of our community, we have great principles of Ubuntu. In my faith, as a Sikh, we have the principle of Sarbat Ka Bhala, which means the well-being of all to serve for our community. Yet when it comes to us as LGBTIQ people, such principles are all too often forgotten. COVID-19 has heightened and exacerbated these inequalities, from housing, sanitation, food insecurity, health, employment conditions. Adversely, they don't just have an impact on us, they have an impact on our families and widely on our communities. Therefore, the issues of diverse families are intersectional, and therefore, as Andrea said, and as the panelists said today, we need an intersectional approach across the board at all levels. Whilst at the international level, conventions provide a framework for us to work with, there is a disconnect, and that disconnect happens somewhere between the global level and the community level. Therefore, we must press our community leaders, our governments, to do much more for diverse families, especially at the time where COVID is causing a lot of damage. With that, I would like to hand you back to Caroline. Thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Nanu, for your remarks and a short summary of challenges to recognition and respect of diverse families in times of a global pandemic and how COVID-19 has exacerbated inequalities, as we were talking about it already. We are very happy to have among us the UN SOGI expert, Victor Madrigal-Bornoz, and that this meeting will directly feed into his next report that is dealing with the impact of COVID-19 on LGBT communities around the world. So, dear Victor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I'm looking at you to know, can you hear me well? Wonderful. I am grateful to be here. In these days, I find myself more and more trying to scratch the sterile surface of the screen to get something back of the energy that we all put into it. And oftentimes that's not very much rewarded with any result, but I do get something back every time that I actually participate in a meeting like this. And I've gotten that back this morning. And it's that I see your faces and I read the names of those that are attending, and it makes me happy. It warms my heart to know that you're fine. And that is a wonderful thing to know. So thank you already very much for that. Thank you to COC, Netherlands, to Jinsogi, to the International Family Equality Day for your wonderful work, and of course to the missions of South Africa and Switzerland for your commitment in relation to this. Now, I'm in a very privileged position because Nanu has already made a wonderful summary. So I'm going to entitle my remarks, my post-concluding remarks, Musings of the Independent Expert, which are going to allow me to just basically throw out a couple of ideas out there without a lot of systematic structure or any particular discipline on my part. But I have been inspired and delighted by this conversation. And I'm beginning my day here in Washington, DC, and I was energized and enthused by this idea of traveling around the world in the last hour and just hearing so many wonderful messages. What is it that we are all, I believe, to take out of these ideas? There's a couple of notions that to me are particularly appealing. I think in very many ways, when we talk about this notion of values of families and their importance, we're talking about a number of concepts. One of them is our yearning to transcend, to actually go beyond the physical, to understand our nature as spiritual beings. And to have yearnings that answer to the very best of our instincts and wants and desires. The wonderful Imania placed us in that notion when she spoke about her yearning to mother, to parent. I believe, I heard at least, that that was a yearning to transcend, to create something greater than herself. And in a way, what we need to recognize is that these yearnings, this wish to actually transcend, is perhaps also what is present in Ubuntu. This idea that I am because others are is precisely, I think, the notion of transcending your own body sphere and to actually understand that energy and value resides in the other, and the recognizing of the other as the very source of energy and realization, happiness of myself. What I actually think is that it is the nurturing, the protection of these best instincts that is at the base of the juridical recognition of certain values. When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in its Article 16.3, when the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights in 23.1 speak of the family as the fundamental and natural unit of society, they are introducing an idea that what is best in us is also natural in us. A plethora of international instruments do this recognition, but of course, the key has always been that after speaking of this fundamental and natural quality, there has been the caveat that maybe, just maybe, what we yearn for is not natural. And I think this is where the task is, where LGBT and gender diverse persons, our task is to reclaim the moral stature of LGTB lives, the spiritual nature of our quest, and the healthful nature of our quest. And this is not a trinity that will be foreign to you, because it's the antithesis of what I consider to be the fundamental enablers of discrimination and violence: pathologization, demonization, and criminalization. So basically, the denial that our existence are moral, are healthful, and are spiritual. Now, I think that it is in it's in furthering the road towards eliminating the notion that what is natural is very much subject to particular contextual understandings, is where we need to work towards the universality of recognition of families of all shapes, sizes, and colors. And it is the unfortunate realpolitik consideration that has been done by certain human rights constructions to say, well, the family is fundamental and natural, but what is natural is to be defined according to a particular context. I find that unsatisfactory, because I actually think that in reality, what that discourse is saying is, I yield to the power of those that may wish to deny certain rights under a certain context and a certain reality. And I think that this is why we need to work towards understanding that there is a nature in these yearnings that are human, that are to be protected. Now, I wanted to recognize the fact that Benny also very much made reference to this issue of what needs to be protected, and also Dominic when making that very important connection with SDGs. And I think that this is where the work needs to go. Caroline, I know that I'm going to be 1 minute too much, but let me just finalize by one idea. No, not yet? Okay. As a Bolivian friend of mine said the other day in a webinar, I will begin to wrap up my first point then. I'm joking. I'm going to wrap up. So, what is it within all of these discussions that I heard you saying? I heard you saying that we must reclaim the valuable nature of our families. The valuable nature because they are moral, the valuable nature because it is a natural and desirable aspect to nurture the spiritual being. But I add something that I heard and that I wanted to work with when we created this statement by 96 regional and global mandate holders. What is it that we wanted to say? And what we wanted fundamentally to say is, first of all, that LGBT persons are everywhere, and that natural yearning that will make them create families that look the way they do is everywhere, and that must be acknowledged. Secondly, that these families are valuable because this is the manner in which LGBT persons will create structures that enable them to go out of that not level playing field to which they came to COVID-19. And that also is because of that they must be protected, because that protection is part of the formula of effective and efficient COVID-19 response. And furthermore, and the third point, what we wanted was to say that this structure, this strong network of social support, contention, and solidarity may be a valuable asset to use in general pandemic response, if it is so that it is nurtured and protected in the right way. And this is the reason why we crafted the ASPIRE guidelines. As you know, ASPIRE stands for acknowledge that LGBT people are everywhere, support civil society working for them, protect LGBT people from persecution, indirect discrimination, see it as a real risk and prevent it. Representation is key. Make sure that you have their expertise over their lives in the crafting of solution. And finally, you must gather evidence, because evidence is key for the building of an effective public policy. So again, I want to thank you very much. Caroline, you mentioned that this will be part of the elements that I have in the drafting of my report. You must not doubt that for a second. This has been an incredibly useful and revealing element, and I'm deeply grateful for being here, for all that you give me, and for the fact that you've given me a warmth to my heart and a smile to my face this early on in my day, which is going to get me through the whole week and probably beyond. Thank you so much. And I send you all my warmest hug.
Thank you, Victor, for this and for your heart-filling words, and to remind us to reclaim the moral and spiritual nature of our request and what is natural. Yeah, just to define it in a certain context, and who is defining this is also very important. And you also reminded the states to include LGBT community in the COVID-19 responses, and we all look very much forward to your next report, of course. So let's go now to the Q&A section. And we have here a question from Bess Hapward, and I'd like to ask the panelists to see who wants to answer. The question is, you can see it here in the Q&A. I would like to hear more about the narrative from non-supporting member states and how rainbow family advocates can support the world of IFED and GIN and so on. Who of the panelists would like to answer this? Hands up. Or also the other speakers, so it's not just. Is there somebody?
I would very much like to give it a stab. I think that you, Caroline, you may be facing one of those situations where everybody would have something really good to say, but nobody wants to take the floor. So I'm going to do the, I'm going to be the one that is not very polite, and I will take it.
Go on.
So I think that a number of the speakers today were very, very much on point when they are discussing the instrumentalization of certain discourses in the protection of structures of power that have been established and are going to preserve themselves no matter what. And I think that from my standpoint as independent expert, as you know, my job is to understand the state of international human rights law and to provide advice to states. What I am advising states is basically on 3 grounds. I'm first advising states that the fundamental principle of equality and non-discrimination, which is what we acknowledge that must reside at any type of recognition of families, is contrary to assuming that certain forms of family are not to be protected, and that it is a duty of states to actively reach out and understand what is the type of conceptualization and definition that can be constructed so that you can have a normative principle around this issue. But it is very clear to me that that normative principle cannot take point of departure essentially in discrimination. We have wonderful statements at regional level. So for example, advisory opinion of OC24 in the Americas will tell you that access to same-sex marriage was seen by the Inter-American Court as an absolute requirement of non-discrimination given the American Convention on Human Rights. Different elements tell us how important it is to work in the principle of non-discrimination, and to all of us, we need to understand, I believe, that the elements are there. This is a question of using the elements that are already there. Non-discrimination is there, integration on SDGs is there, the whole plethora of understanding these juridical elements are there. It's a question of how to integrate them in a discourse. And finally, just very quickly before somebody else does me the favor of taking the floor from me, just to say the other element needs to be deconstructed, and I believe that it was very much Benny, but also Nontando who made reference to this forcefully, is the fact that religion is being used as an instrument to construct stigmatizing and deeply, deeply violatory narratives. And this is why I'm delighted, and you know this, of the existence and the narratives furthered by Jinsogi and other stakeholders, because I do not speak from a standpoint of theology. My dialogue is not theological. My dialogue is, of course, the dialogue of international human rights. And then immediately, Imania is going to say, and Tony is going to say, as they always say, that there's no contradiction between those narratives. And I think that they are right. So it is you who is actually giving us the tools to interpret how to bring that conversation to destroy, in a way, these hateful narratives. It is not a problem to destroy narratives of hate. Huh? They're not protected under international human rights law. Hate speech is not protected under international human rights law. And this is fundamentally the work that you're doing when you're saying, this is not ethical, this is not moral discourse, when you actually use religion to foster violence and discrimination.
Thank you very much, Victor. We have Nontando who wants to say something. Please take the floor. And I wanted to remind the states that they can deliver a statement, and we can kind of upgrade you as a panelist so that everybody can see you. Please let us know.
Yes, I was just about to add that often we see these issues as politicized. During election campaigns, they will be used as a political tool to say, you know, we are fighting infiltration of Western ideas, these are un-African, and so it becomes a political tool that is used to create a kind of division in society where it's portrayed as we are safeguarding, you know, African societies. This is something from the West. And then on the religious side, you also have people using the freedom of religion in order to protect, you know, to sustain, you know, gender inequality, homophobic theologies. So politics, freedom of religion, and even the infiltration of other conversation from different parts of the country coming to infiltrate. So I'm speaking not only of South Africa, but Southern Africa and Africa in general, because we work in all the regions. So those are really disruptive.
Thank you, Nontando. We have Bess from the attendees who would like to speak. Is this made possible? Yeah, please.
Bess, I think you're still muted on your computer.
Hi, everybody. No, I'm happy just to listen to all the expertise and experience. So no need for me to take space, and it's just wonderful to hear all the narratives. And thank you for your guidance.
Okay. Are there other questions that came up? So we have here a question asked from Ermias Tadessa. I would like to hear more from Nontando on South Africa's role on sharing LGBTI family rights to other religious countries like Ethiopia. Would you like to answer that, Nontando?
I can't speak for every part of sort of like religions, but what happens is that most religions are continental, and so you have a situation like our organization is continental, so we would be able to put the issues of equality, gender equality, LGBTI equality through our members. And so, but what we're seeing again is that the divisions within churches that are across the continent is so deep that they are on different camps. You have those that will say, LGBTI equality, and those that will be saying, it's a sin against God. So we are finding even though in South Africa there's still that battle even amongst religions within the Constitution that allows for the equality. We find the pushback is coming from religion. So it's a very conflicted status that we find ourselves in. And it's for the voices of human rights and dignity to unite and to across the continent and to keep chipping away at these narratives of that dehumanize people. So I'm not sure whether I've answered that. Tony, you can also step in.
Thank you, Nontando. We have Dominic wants to say something.
Just unmuting. Thank you. I wanted to come back to the points that were discussed by Victor and others before. I think it's interesting to take a focus on sort of non-supportive states, but we should also recognize that those countries that are recognizing LGBTQI more in legislation, they also need to do some catching up in terms of the policies they're actually implementing that still have the traditional designs, that still are exclusionary in many ways. And part of their success is going to speak to a broader global discourse about how to fully implement the principles that we want to see. It's worth remembering that the policies as simple as childcare were not well used 30 years ago. We didn't have statistics on education 20 years ago. We're asking states to move quickly on things that they don't have any long tradition of understanding or working with. And it's not as if there is some sort of general consensus, even amongst European states, about what constitutes a family in something as basic as a family allowance. There's all sorts of unintentional exclusion going on that needs to be addressed throughout policies for families, not just the treatment of family more broadly. And I think that I think we can work on these. We can work on all of these challenges, and real success. Well, that's going to unlock information and opportunity for those countries that are lagging behind. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominique. I have Tony wants to take the floor, and if I don't see any other urgent questions or hands raised, I would then, in regards of the time, wrap up afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. So I just wanted to respond to a couple of things.
I think that Bess's original question about non-supportive states and some of the comments that Victor made and the question that went to Nontando about other African states are all very relevant to this problem. And also what Dominic is saying about intentional and unintentional exclusion. I think that we all know that in many places around the world, faith traditions are used, as Nontando said, often in collaboration with politics, are used in ways which create normative standards which exclude people who don't fit into the binary, who don't fit into the idea of the nuclear family or heteronormativity. But I think that and I think that Victor is right when he says that all the elements are there that are required in order to achieve inclusion for everybody. The difficulty is that in many places around the world, faith and religious tradition is used politically, basically, as a tool to exclude, as a tool to engage groups of people who might not be otherwise engaged in political discourse about, a silly example, whether there's a street lamp on the corner. So instead of talking about practical, everyday, on the ground things, you start talking about these grand ideas. And then you talk about these grand ideas in ways that exclude people who don't fit into the norm. And so I think that part of the solution to all of this is exactly what Victor says, is to point out that LGBTIQ++ people are everywhere, that our families are everywhere. Because it's kind of difficult to argue with the reality. It becomes more difficult when this person is standing in front of you and they're clearly a human being. And then beyond that also to claim back our spirituality, to claim back our morality as LGBTIQ+ people and members of families. And to say, in response to those people who would like to use faith traditions against us, but you cannot, because that is not a legitimate use of faith. And as Victor said, Imania and I always say this, and we will continue to say it, the aims, I believe, of the human rights system and of all of our faith traditions, every faith tradition in the world, are very, very much aligned. They're about flourishing, abundant lives for everybody. And that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Tony. There came one comment and one question in, and then I have the question from Andrea. So I ask you if 10 minutes over time would be okay. And so the question here is, families in LGBTIQ communities worldwide are seeing regressive legislation being enacted by states around us under the guise of COVID-19 response that seeks to denormalize our lives. What can civil society and faith communities do together to more effectively address this and encourage states to resist pressure to roll back critically on equality and inclusion measures? So I think partly we have already talked about it, but the question goes to the speakers and panelists and participants here. If there's somebody who would like to add a short comment on this. And I'll quickly read the other, I think it's more a comment. I think we need to use an intersectional framework to include all of us, not only our movements to address LGBTIQ and so on, issues of fighting racism and so on. So in the meantime, would there be anybody, Imania, and then later on, Andrea, please.
I think it's a good question, and it's also a very good comment from Ellen Woodsworth. all the activists and the defenders and the human rights warriors that are working on the ground. You heard this from Notando, you heard this from Benny, you heard this from Andrea, and Dominic, and Nanu. The only way forward for us as a movement is to move away from the silo mentality that LGBTI is our fight, right? The only way to progress is if we link our struggle to other struggles, to other movements. It's the only way, because doing it alone, we'll be back in another 1,000 years and we've probably progressed like maybe, you know, not that much. The only way in this lifetime, in our generation, is by linking our struggles, linking it with supportive states that want to support our cause, and let's do this. It is the only way, because when the feminist movements drag trans movements into their struggle, when they succeed, we succeed, you know? And this is so evident in Global South movements. This is so evident for us because we say it so many times. We're not single issue people living single issue lives. We're not. You know, you go to any Global South community, it is about linking together communities so they can advance and progress an agenda. We should learn from that. Intersectional approaches, frameworks, whatever it is, that should be what we should be talking about at any given time. Link and progress, link and advance, link and advance. And great question. And thank you, Ellen, for your comment. And yes, agree, we should be doing more of that.
Thank you, Manya. Andrea, please.
Thank you. I would like to add something going back to the issue of how religion is used. Here, for example, in Latin America, the campaign "Do not mess with my children" is attacking our rights, and they are very important, and they are growing. They have high resources, they have a global strategy, and they are in politics. They are advocating in politics. Some of them are in the parliament, and they are having good results right now because they stopped 2 bills from passing in the parliament. One of them was from including the LGBT plus perspective in sexual comprehensive education, and they stopped that bill. So that's why I think that the work that organizations like Jean, it is so important. And also I fully agree with Imania about alliances. We need to find allies sorry, in the feminism, in faith too, in TV shows. We have to have a broader vision to keep going, because we don't have to think that what we have right now for example, in Argentina, it is forever, because the hate speeches are very powerful in Latin American region. So we have to be very aware of this and pay very high level of attention to these threats. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. We are now coming to an end of this side event on recognition and respect of diverse families in times of a global pandemic. So in our world trip today, we traveled from South Africa to Samoa, Australia, Kenya, Argentina, Washington, DC, so different places. And we learned a lot, I think, about the diversities of families all over the world. We have to come to advance this, and we learned how important it is also to recognize and respect the diversity of families, to support them and to work with an inclusive understanding of family. So we need the debate on families' rights within the UN that this continues, and we need family equality. That means the recognition, protection of diverse forms of family by states, by the UN member states and the societies is crucial, because family equality is a precondition to achieve social justice and inclusion for all. So I want to thank all of you. I want to thank the speakers, the panelists, the contributors, and everyone who joined us, who asked questions, who listened today. And the link of the side event will be sent afterwards to all of you. And we want to keep having this conversation with everyone, including states, afterwards. And I thank you again all for participating. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you to all of you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank
you. Thank you all, and thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Victor.
Thank you.
Bye, Mania.
Everybody.
Maria.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Danny,
It was
Dominic.
beautiful.
It was beautiful.